D1-265. It'll be okay, son. The doctor's voice rang out with the calm, professional demeanour that he had been trained to use when dealing with trauma patients. You're in safe hands now. The young man lay on the wheeled bed, still clutching the wound in his shoulder even though it had been thoroughly bandaged. The undersuit of his exo-armour was mostly unscathed on the left side of his body, whereas the right side barely managed to hold any resemblance of having ever been there, and the remaining shredded biology that would have been covered was only contained due to a generous application of biofoam sealant from his combat armour. The doctor looked at the table with the bio-ID displayed. 22. The kid was 22 years old, and an orbital insertion drop trooper. In all his years he had treated only a handful of OIDTs. The Venn diagram overlap between the kind of people that let themselves get shot towards a battlefield in a tiny pod from orbit and the kind of people who ignored their injuries was almost a complete overlap. A perfect circle. The tablet didn't list a name, only an ID number. D1-265. He looked at the trooper. The kid was somehow still conscious. Can you hear me? He leaned over the kid. The one functional eye opened and looked directly at him. Yes, sir. A rattling breath and the slight gurgle told him that the respiratory system was leaking into the airways. I'll need... The trooper cut him off. D1-265. Lance Corporal, 1st Airborne. Do you know where you are? The corporal looked around the operating suite and gave the smallest nod. Apergast, Northern Hemisphere. The doctor nodded. You took a direct hit from shock blast artillery. I'll get you back into one piece. Then he looked at the anesthesia nurse and gave her the smallest nod. The corporal grabbed his wrist with the one arm that still had all of its appendages. I'm not a hero, he said firmly. The doctor gave him a quizzical look. I heard the medics talk in the air hopper. They said that we were heroes when we lived it out. I'm not a hero. He coughed once before he continued. I'm just a kid who didn't have a family to feed, or a girlfriend to lose when he walked past the recruitment office. He coughed again. This time, blood and some tissue that definitely didn't come from his mouth sprayed the operation gown. Don't let them make me into one. The corporal gave in to the anesthesia, and the doctor did his job. 17 hours later, the doctor walked out of the OR and headed for the waiting area. It was empty. There were no families on the front lines, so he didn't expect any, but usually the squad leader or the sergeant or anyone from the immediate chain of command would be there to receive news. Empty. No one. He knew better. Drop troopers were expendable, so why should anyone show up for this kid? The fact that no one had filled him with rage. He turned around and stomped towards the back door. He needed some space, some air. The outright fury that threatened to strangle him demanded room. Room to scream, room to howl, room to cry. A nurse stepped in front of him, blocking his path. Doctor? He looked her in her eyes, but gave no answer. Your presence is required out front, she said matter-of-factly, as she turned him around and gently shoved him in the direction. She escorted him out into the mobile hospital compound. A general stood by the entry and greeted him. Dr. Sawyer? He nodded. Yes? D1-265? There was a tinge of hope in the general's voice. He gently shook his head. The damage was too extensive. I did my best. I believe you, Doc. I've seen the footage from the field. He's not a hero. The words blurted out of him, and the second they had been sounded, the entire compound went silent. The general gave him an evil glare. What? He told me so. He said to not let you make him into one. Dr. Sawyer looked over the compound. Hundreds of troopers from several different divisions were filling the open space in front of the hospital. They were all looking at the two men in the entry. The general smiled. That sounds like him. A short pause while the general gathered his thoughts. I tell you what, Doc, how about I let you know exactly how he ended up on your table, and then you call him how you see fit. He nodded as a reply. The 1st Airborne were dropped in on the outskirts of the main military fortification 3 days ago. Their mission was to occupy the hostiles' attention while the rest of the teams got into position. We dropped in 15 troopers, and the Lance Corporal was the squad leader. The general nodded towards the front of the crowd, where 3 men wearing OIDT credentials were positioned, one in a wheelchair, one with a bandage around his face, clinging to the 3rd who had a newly fitted artificial right leg. They were supposed to fall back once our artillery started shooting, but the dropships got hammered on the way in. I told the corporal that the mission was a bust, to fall back and wait for a pickup, but he refused. Told me that the compound needed to be taken so the civilian escape corridor could be secured. The general gestured out to the rest of the crowd. These are the men that followed him, the teams that disobeyed orders to fall back because some kid with nothing to lose wandered into a recruitment office. The crowd shared a cautious smile. They had apparently all heard that tale before. Corporal 265 ordered a perimeter set up and led his drop troops into an assault sprint, drawing fire from the compound. They ran circles around that fortification for 3 days, forcing them to waste their munitions on heavy infantry, while the rest was supporting them with long-range ordnance. The general shook his head. Then, the enemy pulled out their Hail Mary, a shot blast 2200mm grenade. That is the single largest high-explosive warhead ever to be shot out of a cannon, Doctor. It does not stop heavy armor. It eviscerates it. They weren't shooting at the troopers. They weren't shooting at the supporting teams. They were shooting at the corridor of civilian refugees. Their own species. Lance Corporal D1-265 had the last of his men throw him at the projectile, so he could detonate it as far away from the refugees as possible. He went face to face with the devil himself and lived long enough to tell you the one lie he has told so often, that he began believing it himself. So you tell me, Doc, how do we bury him? Read by a good bean.